All right, great. We're going to move on. All right, you are attending a virtual meeting of the California Farm Demonstration Network, and you can see here that we have 6 agricultural organizations collaborating with farmers and ranchers around the state to help make this network a reality. So we've got the University of California Ag and Natural Resources, UC Davis, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, my organization, the California Association for Resource Conservation Districts, the California Farm Bureau, and the California Department of Food and Ag, who is also generously funding this session today. So thank you very much to them. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Brent Holtz, who's a UCCE farm advisor and farmer in the San Joaquin Valley. He's going to be presenting on what are the benefits of whole orchard recycling, including disease control. We're going to get started on that presentation in just a minute, but I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the California Farm Demonstration Network real quick. So the overarching objective of the CFDN, the California Farm Demonstration Network, as you can see here, is to showcase the implementation of conservation practices and systems which can provide a pathway for adoption by new and experienced farmers, and it'll provide a practical learning opportunities while at the same time fostering the formation of local connections. We are supporting the formation of local hubs of agricultural technical assistance, and we're hosting these meetings and disseminating information about soil and conservation practices. And we're also developing a standalone website where the best information and networking capabilities will live in the long term. So today's meeting is the second in a 4-part series. Last month, we had Dr. Eric Brennan lead a presentation and a discussion on what happens to soil properties when you add compost and cover crop. And we have next month, Jessica Chiardis is going to talk about how to pull a soil sample for meaningful results. And in June, Jennifer Moore will be speaking on how to test for soil microbial dynamics. The QR code here, if you have a QR code reader, will bring you to the web page that gives the registration opportunity, as well as will be the page where we will post the link to the recordings for all of these meetings. So eventually these will all migrate to a standalone website for the California Farm Demonstration Network. But in the meantime, the CARCD is going to be hosting these. We will have CEU units available to certified crop advisors at the end of the presentation. If you need to leave sometime before the Q&A happens, and before you see that QR code, I'd like to ask you just to put your full name and your CCA number in the chat box, and I'll make sure to retrieve that later and submit that. I also want to note right now that I was not able to line up the continuing ed units for the PCAs in time for this presentation. I sincerely apologize about that, but I hope that you will stay and learn with us today. At this point, I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. And there we go. I would like to introduce Dr. Brent Holtz, and he's with the University of California Cooperative Extension in the San Joaquin Valley. He's both a farm advisor and a farmer. And I'd also like to introduce my co-host, Karen Lowell. She is a certified crop advisor and an area agronomist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Salinas. Karen's going to be fielding your questions in the chat today, and will facilitate the question and answer session after Dr. Holtz's presentation. So we have up to an hour and a half for the presentation, plus a great discussion afterward that we're looking forward to. I invite everyone to enter your questions in the chat room as we go. And Karen's going to be kind of organizing those, and we'll field the questions after the presentation. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to you, Brent, if you could say a little bit more about yourself and how the presentation is going to flow. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good morning, Sarah and Karen. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you and this California Farm Demonstration Network. I appreciate that. I've been a farm advisor with the University of California for unfortunately 28 years now, and I grew up on a family farm also that gave me lots of experiences. So anyway, I want to talk to you about a project that I've been sort of working on for, I hate to say 3 decades, but it's true. It's just kind of evolved. And it started with my own family farm. So, and now I'm told not to talk for a whole hour and a half. So I'm probably only going to have about a half an hour presentation, and I have a lot of slides that I kind of tell a story with, and I'm hoping that we'll have discussion at the end, and we can go back to some of the slides in more detail if they perked anybody's interest. So anyway, thank you again for the opportunity, and I'm going to talk about the benefits of whole orchard recycling on second generation almond trees, tree growth, yield, and replant disease. So this project actually evolved from farming on the urban edge. And this is my grandfather's farm in the north section of Modesto. Ultimately, we were surrounded, but for about 40 years, we were the north border of Modesto. And of course, long before the Clean Air Act of 2002, you couldn't burn your brush if the wind was blowing southward and would take all the smoke into these houses. So we had to find an alternative to burning our brush long before there were air quality restrictions. And our alternative, we purchased this Brush Bandit wood chipper. It's a pretty nice wood chipper. It could do several orchards worth of brush. It can chip up to a 9-inch diameter piece of wood. So it could chip a lot of brush and make a small wood chip that wouldn't interfere with harvest, but it had to be hand fed. So it wasn't the ideal solution for large almond acreages, but it worked for a small family farm that we were. And here's a picture of me in graduate school back in 1993 advocating for chipping brush. So it's been a long road for me, and wood chips have been a big part of it. But after about a decade of chipping brush, you know, I would notice as a grad student, you know, we have a lot more mushroom growth in our orchard in the wintertime, and I'd sample around, and you know, we used to never notice mushrooms before, and so just a decade worth of wood chipping, you could tell just visually we were changing that topsoil. And I did a project early on as a farm advisor where I just sampled our orchard versus our neighbors where we'd been chipping for a while, and you could see the top inch of the soil was completely changing to this dark, high organic matter layer on the left versus this standard sandy loam that you didn't see a change in profile in the controls. So I spent about a decade comparing, you know, wood chipped orchards versus non-wood chipped orchards, and you know, there's not a lot of wood chips generated when you're just, you know, chipping up the annual prunings on an annual basis, but we did see more wood rotting basidiomycetes, which are basically mushrooms. We saw more bacterial and fungal feeding nematodes, not the plant pathogenic nematodes, but nematodes that feed on fungi and bacteria. We saw increased soil nutrient levels in this top layer. We saw lower pH, and we saw more organic matter and higher soil carbon. So then came along the Clean Air Act in 2002, and you know, before that, when we pushed our prunings or when we took out old orchards, we usually just burned it. But after the Clean Air Act, we started shredding our brush with like a Flory shredder is shown here. And then when we actually removed an orchard, we started using these big grinders and grinding up wood chips, but we were hauling them to these cogeneration plants and not leaving them in the orchard. Oh, and this just shows the the, you know, the industry basically evolved to shred their brush and no longer burn the brush. But when I started seeing these big piles of wood chips hanging around and getting shipped off to cogeneration plants, I started wondering, can these whole orchards be incorporated into the soil and not taken to a cogeneration plant? And can we return all this organic matter to our orchards without negatively affecting the next generation orchard that we would plant? And back in 2000, which doesn't seem that long ago, but I realize it's 21 years ago, I used our almond wood chipper and did a small barrel trial just to see if the young trees would grow in soil amended with a high concentration of wood chips. And here I'm adding a 1/3 mix of wood chips to 2/3 parts soil. I thought that would probably imitate what orchard recycling would be. I didn't have any idea at that point how much biomass was actually in an orchard when you return it to the soil. And this rate turned out to be a 300 ton per acre rate, which is more than a typical orchard recycling, but it still served the purpose as a good trial, I think, for me. And I planted these 1 almond tree per barrel. Some of the barrels had 1/3 part wood chips and the other in a replicated trial. The holes were cut out in the bottom, and they were planted and they were irrigated with about 49 parts per million nitrate in irrigation water, which I'll bring up later as being important. But almost immediately we noticed, if you see the barrels up here where there's no water, you can see the wood chips, it would infiltrate very quickly. And so I started measuring infiltration rates. And of course, when I added the organic matter, it greatly increased the infiltration rate in this barrel trial. When I looked at current season shoot growth, there was more shoot growth the first 2 years, but by the 3rd and 4th year, the wood chips had more current season shoot growth. When I looked at midday leaf stem water potentials with a pressure chamber, I could see less water stress with the trees growing in the wood chip treatment compared to the trees without the wood chips. And ultimately, this is the kind of data that came from this barrel trial. It turned out to be important with the CDFA when we added a whole orchard recycling to the Healthy Soils program. As you know, we showed a significant increase in soil organic matter and soil organic carbon over almost a 20-year period. And this was helpful in showing that whole orchard recycling could in fact increase soil organic carbon and organic matter. We also saw nitrates increase. It took a long response, but almost 7 or 8 years later, as the wood chips were finally decomposing completely, we saw a spike in nitrate levels in the soil. We also saw mushrooms again in the barrels, just like we'd seen in the orchard. We also saw free-living nematodes increase in the barrels, like we had seen in with shredding. And more importantly, the first 4 years, the trees without wood chips had greater trunk circumference, but by the 5th and 6th year, the trees with the wood chips started showing significantly increased trunk circumference. Oops, going the wrong way. So after 8 years of that trial, I felt like we were confident to return to the orchard and a real experiment, and can whole orchards be incorporated in the soil without negatively affecting the next orchard that would be planted. So, and just want to remind you, when we grind up an orchard, a grower has spent 25 to 30 years worth of adding water and nutrients and sunlight with photosynthesis, building carbon and nutrients. And when we haul this 25 to 30 years of organic matter accumulation and carbon is taken away from the system, which in an almond orchard is about 60 tons per acre. So, can we keep this in the system and grow another generation? And in this first trial, I wanted to incorporate the trees into the soil. I didn't have access to a whole or a horizontal grinder or a tub grinder, but I did have access to this Iron Wolf, which is actually a rock crusher. It's built to crush rocks and trees, and it's a 100,000-pound machine and has 1,000 horsepower. That head there that spins that you see weighs about 25 tons and is covered with titanium teeth. So it was built to crush rocks, but it could crush trees and grind them up also. So we put it to work at the Kearney Ag Center, and this bar would push trees over and it would grind the tree up. And then this bar could go down and it could reverse and rototiller the tree in going backwards. So this is what a row of stone fruits look like about 5 minutes after it was incorporated. And you can see there's 3 rows that are incorporated here. And these trees in the back are going to be pushed and burned. So there were 2 treatments in this experiment: grinding the trees up into the soil, pushing the trees and burning them, and spreading the ashes back in place. And as I tell people, this is what happens to trees in nature. As you know, in California, they either burn up in a fire or they decompose here here's a redwood forest where they're slowly decomposing. So we had a replicated trial at the Kearney Ag Center with 286 trees, and there were seven replications and the 2 treatments. So here are the trees were planted again. The second generation trees were planted exactly at the same spot where the first generation tree was rototillered into the ground. And here are the trees in the first leaf. You could tell the Iron Wolf treatments because the rototillering stimulated nut sedge and the burn treatment did not. And here are the trees growing in the second leaf. And the main point was the grinding didn't stunt the second generation trees right away, which was a big worry. Here's the trees in their third leaf, and here's the trees on the bottom right in their fourth leaf showing a big crop. Again, we saw trends reappear. We saw more mushrooms in the grind treatment. We saw more free-living nematodes in the grind treatment. We saw more soil aggregating fungi in the grind treatment. And we saw, again, if we looked at the soil organic matter or the organic carbon over time, the increases were not dramatic as in the barrel trial, which was a 300 ton per acre rate. This trial, I don't think I remember, I mentioned at the start, was a 30 ton per acre rate. So we didn't see the same huge increases in soil organic matter and organic carbon as we did in the barrel trial. But this was a large scale orchard trial, but we still saw significant differences. We saw significant differences in carbon at different soil depths. And we saw an increase in carbon sequestration. 8 tons per hectare of carbon were sequestered after 9 growing seasons compared to the burn controls. We also estimated, just based on an increase in organic matter, that we had about a 15% increase in water holding capacity. And we had improved soil aggregation. We had reduced compaction. We had higher infiltration rates, and we had increased water retention. We also had less stress. I'm not going to talk about that experiment, but we had less stress in the grind treatment trees versus the burn treatment trees over the course of the season. And we also had the Carmel variety, was one of 3 varieties in this trial, and it can show bud failure, which is a genetic problem of almonds under stress. And we had less bud failure show up in the grind treatment than the burn. When we looked at, I had 3 different varieties in this trial. When we looked at the different varieties, the Butte variety was the largest, and here we're looking at tree circumference, but the Butte variety's tree circumference was significantly greater than in the grind treatment than in the burn. followed by the nonpareil, and nonpareil in the grind was significantly greater than the nonpareil in the burn, and Carmel in the grind treatment was significantly greater in tree circumference than Carmel in the burn. So that's kind of a busy slide, but anyway, trunk circumference was greater in the grind treatment compared to the burn. When we looked at yields, I have more 9 seasons, I guess, with the butte. Very seldom was any season's yield significantly greater. One season, when looking at one season, was that, I'm getting tongue-tied. Very seldom was there a significant increase in the grind treatment yield over the burn in any one season, but in every season, the grind always had a slightly higher yield. And when you accumulated it over time, there's almost 2,000 pound kernel difference in the grind treatment over the burn in a nine season total. When you look at the nonpareil, I only had 6 seasons with a nonpareil. We had some seasons in the nonpareil that were very significant, even within that season, with the grind being greater. But with just 6 seasons of cumulative yield, we had over 2,000 pounds increase in kernel yield. So we've seen yield increase with the grind versus the burn. So to summarize this orchard trial, we've seen increased soil organic matter, increased organic carbon, soil nutrients, soil microbial diversity, and of course, more importantly for the growers, increased orchard productivity. Now in 2015, the cogeneration plants started going under. Utility companies are being mandated to buy more solar and wind power, and burning wood chips to create electricity is kind of like burning coal to generate electricity. So cogeneration plants started closing, and this is the first grower in 2015 that got frustrated. He had a big pile of wood chips. He'd heard about my work and called me up, and I convinced him to spread those wood chips on the ground and incorporate them back, and thus whole orchard recycling actually started in a commercial setting in 2015. Instead of the iron wolf now, the iron wolf wasn't very economical. It could only do about 1 or 2 acres a day, whereas these horizontal grinders now can grind up 15 to 20 acres a day. Of course, the process now involves about 5 machines compared to the one. You have an excavator pulling up the trees. You have front-end loaders carrying the trees to the big grinder. You have another excavator that feeds the trees into the grinder. And then if you want to spread the wood chips, you've got another loader that has to load the wood chips, and they have to be spread back on the orchard floor with a modified manure spreader. So there's about a 5 or 6 machine process now just with whole orchard recycling. But with whole orchard recycling, the chips are spread very evenly on the orchard floor. You can see here. Unfortunately, though, growers used to get their wood chips removed for free because the orchard removal companies were getting paid for the wood chips from the cogeneration plant. So now growers are spending about $600 an acre to recycle their orchard, and another $400 an acre to spread the wood chips back out on their orchard floor, like you see here. After the wood chips are spread, then the normal orchard reincorporation or replanting practices can occur. Usually after spreading, we would rip with a deep ripper, then we would disc the wood chips in, and if your grower was going to fumigate, they would do that before replanting. Just I want to mention though, when this is orchard in Manteco where we where we had a trial. Excuse me, I'm going to take a water break. I feel my throat getting. Thank you. This is an orchard where we spread 64 tons per acre of wood chips. You can see them on the ground. It's really not that bad. 64 tons per acre sounds pretty awful, but it's about 2 inches thick on the ground. But I had the wood chips analyzed, and the wood chips are about 0.3% nitrogen. So if you're putting on 64 tons per acre, you're putting about 400 pounds of nitrogen that's tied up in that wood back on the ground. They're 0.2% potassium, so you're putting about 250 pounds of potassium on the ground. They're 0.6% calcium, so you're putting almost 800 pounds of calcium per acre. And the wood chips are 50% carbon. So at a 64 ton per acre rate, you're putting on 64,000 pounds of carbon per acre. These nutrients won't be available right away. They can take up to 7 years to decompose. So it's going to be a gradual release, but I think it's going to be a beneficial release in the long run. But in the short term, we probably just upset our carbon to nitrogen balance, because here's a young orchard, the same young orchard in Manteca, 64 tons per acre were applied. And you can see from the orchard floor, this is in May. We haven't applied a herbicide to the ground in over a year, and there are like no weeds growing. So there are some small weeds growing there. They look very nitrogen deficient, and the trees, they pushed out initially well, but they stopped growing. So we realized that we had upset the carbon to nitrogen ratio here, and we immediately tried to implement a nitrogen program to keep these trees growing. So this kind of caught me surprised that also the growers tried to vertigate with a double line drip system with young trees, which is not a very efficient system in first year trees. You can see the tree on the left, the emitters don't line up nicely with the tree, and the tree's not getting any water or fertilizer, whereas this tree, one of the emitters does line up nicely. But you can see we're adding granular fertilizer here, trying to make sure we get the desired amount of fertilizer to the tree, because it gets diluted with the drip line system. But in June, we were still significantly deficient when we looked at leaf analysis in this plot, but we were applying a lot of fertilizer, and by July we had caught up. The trees in the wood chip plots had caught up to the control plot trees. So, but we ended up putting on about 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre in this orchard, which is more than we thought we needed. But the grower tried to get his trees from being stunted into their normal growth pattern. But we realized that we could be more efficient with the nitrogen in the future. Looking at the tree growth, these are trees growing with wood chips, fumigated and non-fumigated, and trees growing without wood chips. We actually ended up at the end of the year having increased tree growth with the wood chips than without the wood chips after we overcame the initial stunting, and the fumigation effect in both situations with wood chips and without still had significantly greater trees. So if you need to fumigate, we recommend you don't not fumigate just because your whole orchard recycling. This is the same orchard though. At the end of that first year, you can see we got the desired tree growth we would want in first year almond trees, but you can actually see there's a lot of wood chips still left on the orchard surface. And I keep reminding growers that you have 3 years to work that in before your first harvest. So don't be too concerned about it. And here, this grower brought in a Northwest tiller, which does a very good job of incorporating anything left in the tree row. And basically the grower was ready to harvest at the end of his first year, even though he had 2 more years of tree growth before his first harvest. And I just want to point out, we saw mushrooms by the millions in this plot. So again, we saw significantly greater mushroom activity. But we felt that we did apply more nitrogen than we needed. And this is another grower. In the first trial, that one was in 2016. This is in 2017. Working with another grower that did whole orchard recycling. And actually, I tried, they had double line drip also, and I did not think that was going to be a good way to apply the fertilizer. So I actually did a hand trial where I applied granular fertilizer. And the tree on the right got 0.8 ounces of nitrogen in March, and the tree on the left didn't. And in April, you could just see significant differences just in that that 1 month it got rained in nicely. So it gave us a clue that we weren't putting on nitrogen early enough. And we started a series of experiments to look at that. And from that, looking at our nitrogen applications and timing and leaf analysis, we realized that the early fertilization was more important than later in the year. And we narrowed it down in this particular trial. In our first trial, we applied almost 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen. We got no benefit of applying more than 68 pounds of nitrogen in this trial. And so then we moved forward into another trial to see if we could reduce the amount of fertilizer we were applying if we started fertilizing earlier. And this is my most recent trial put out in 2019 at the Kearney Ag Center. And this is a 70 ton per acre of wood chips on the right. You can see they didn't incorporate all that well in the berm. And then here's the control. And in this trial, we actually started fertilizing at planting time with 1/4 ounce of nitrogen per tree at planting time, which we usually don't do. And here's the trees growing at the end of the year. They ended up getting 5 ounces total of nitrogen per tree per year, and which actually came to about 45 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we normally recommend about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre in first year almond trees without whole orchard recycling. So we narrowed our recommendation down from 100 pounds after whole orchard recycling to now just 45 pounds. And when we actually looked at trunk diameters in this trial, where we actually added the fertilizer early to the organic matter, I talked to another scientist in the UC system, Sat Darshan, and he thinks we're feeding the microbes early, and I think he's probably right. And anyway, the initial trees, this was the first time in our experiments where the whole orchard recycling trees actually had greater trunk circumference the first year compared to the controls. Usually we'd had reduced growth. And when we looked at our leaf nitrogen levels in this trial too, they were actually significantly greater in the whole orchard recycling treatment. Even though the treatments, the trees, the control, and the whole orchard recycling received the same amount of nitrogen through the season. So anyway, this is Patrick Brown and his team came out with the best management practices of nitrogen fertilization for first leaf. Basically, they're recommending 3 ounces of nitrogen that first leaf and 4 ounces the second. If you're doing whole orchard recycling, we would recommend now 5 ounces that first year of nitrogen and 4 to 5 that second year. We haven't seen a need to add additional nitrogen in that second year after whole orchard recycling. I just want to talk briefly, and I'm sorry, folks, I'm almost done. I hope I'm not wearing you out too much, but we've also done some work with incorporating anaerobic soil disinfestation, ASD, with different substrates. We've looked at the rice meal, which is pretty high in nitrogen. We've looked at ground almond hulls and shells, and we've incorporated those with and without whole orchard recycling. And this is work that Greg Brown, a USDA scientist at UC Davis, has been mostly leading that effort. But we again use the Northwest tiller to incorporate the substrates in the wood chips, and then we put multiple drip lines down, and then clear plastic. And the object is you add this carbon substrate, you add water, you heat it up, you create a solar panel, and you hopefully disinfect the soil and kill some of the fungal and nematode pathogens that contribute to replant disease. And this is work that Greg Brown did, and here you see the whole orchard recycling. This is trunk circumference. In this trial, whole orchard recycling didn't look as good as fumigation or control, but in this, to be fair, we didn't fertilize extra or early for these trees. This is before we realized it. So I think now we know better to how to fertilize after whole orchard recycling, whether we're fumigating or not. But the point I want to make out is some of Greg's work. We looked at survival of Pythium ultimum, which is a plant pathogen similar to Phytophthora, that they're oomycetes. They both have cellulose in their cell walls, and here is no wood chips with wood chips in the control, and the wood chips significantly reduced the survival of Pythium ultimum. In the fumigation, of course, both were eliminated with wood chips or without wood chips, but with ASD, the wood chip treatment completely eliminated the survival of Pythium ultimum comparable to fumigation. And the reason why this is, we believe, is that Pythium and Phytophthora both have, I think I mentioned, cellulose in their cell walls. So when these fungi and bacteria are decomposing the wood chips, they're probably also decomposing the cell walls of Pythium and Phytophthora, and so we have this decline in these particular pathogens. And we still have to do more work on other pathogens with whole orchard recycling. But this is phospholipid fatty acid analysis of the different treatments in that trial: control, fumigation, rice bran, almond hull and shell, and wood chips. And you can see we did have a significant increase in total bacteria and fungi and protozoans and microbial increase with the wood chips. And we also looked at saprophytic fungi and the mycorrhizae fungi, and we saw a significant increase in these with whole orchard recycling. As you can expect, we're adding 64 tons of wood chips per acre. Well, I'm almost done, and I just want to say, this is from my soils book, talking about the nitrogen cycle, but way back even in the 80s, they knew that soil organic matter was very important in the nitrogen cycle, helping to bind ammonia and nitrate and keep it in the root zone of these trees or crops. No trees here, but corn plants. But I mean, the point is I think this building our soil organic matter is going to improve ultimately our nitrogen efficiency. And I think that whole orchard recycling is basically a once in a 30-year chance for a grower to try to build their soil organic matter. I think the high lignin cellulose content of the wood chips makes it stick around in the soil longer than other amendments. And our soils for the most part are very low in soil organic matter. And we don't have very many practices that we implement where we actually continually build our soil organic matter. So I think any practice that builds soil organic matter is going to be beneficial in the long term, despite there might be initial setbacks with the initial application. There's a large team of people that have been working on this project with whole orchard recycling, and I'm very grateful for them because most everybody here is smarter than I am on the concept. And May Cullenberg has been leading a greenhouse gas trial funded by the CDFN with Sudan Gao and other professors. Here's some results from their gas work. Basically, the whole orchard recycling treatment is giving off more greenhouse gases. We also have another CDFA project where we're optimizing our fertilization and irrigation recommendations with whole orchard recycling, led by Amisha Port-Peterson, another USDA scientist at Davis. Finally, I want to mention that the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District has begun to reward growers $300 to $600 per acre, up to $60,000 per grower to implement whole orchard recycling. And I finally got some data from them. Since November 2018, 539 growers have received over 18 million to recycle over 25,000 acres and diverting over 700,000 tons of woody biomass from being burned. So I think that's a great great compensation for growers, and the Healthy Soils program has also approved whole orchard recycling as a practice, and I believe NRCS is also implementing a practice to help growers. So I've done a rough estimate, but I think about 40,000 acres now have been recycled in the San Joaquin Valley. And so I hope that that number continues to grow. And I thank you for listening to me today. And my support has come from the Almond Board and CDFA and the USDA, and of course the University of California. So I'm worn out, but hopefully there's some questions and that we might be able to address. Oh, 43 minutes. I'm sorry. I took longer than I thought.
Karen, we can't hear you right now. Karen's gonna go ahead and lead a question and answer session. She's been fielding your questions out of the chat as Dr. Holtz has been presenting. And hopefully we gotcha. Take it from here, Karen.
Sorry, I had a couple places to unmute and I only did one. Thank you, Brent. And I think based on the questions we're getting, I sort of glumped them into groups. But one thing I wanted to make sure that we tell folks is that you have a very good and comprehensive website where they can get a lot of information. Do you want to share your screen and show them that website? Oh, he's taking a call.
I didn't turn off my computer. I turned off my cell phone. Sorry.
Do you want to pop over and show them your website where they can find a lot more information and more links to things? Or do you want me to do it? You want me to share my screen?
Yeah. Why don't you do that? Because I don't know if I have the website up right now.
Okay. I have to find it. I'm looking at two different screens. Let's see. So can you guys see the screen, Sarah?
Looks good.
Yeah. So this is a website that Brent has. And Brent, do you want to just tell them a little bit about how they might use this as a place to find? Because there's all kinds of, as much detail as you just offered them, there's even more to be found here.
Yeah, we have a whole orchard recycling website. It's orchardrecycling.ucdavis.edu, and we have a lot of information on there, a lot of our data, a lot of our work and publications and talks and outreach to growers, and so we think this is a good site for you to go, and we're trying to keep it up to date with our most pertinent information, and we have a grower's guide that we recently just added to whole orchard recycling. I see it there. So anyway, I would suggest looking at this website if you're interested.
Good, thank you. I will come back down. I'll just leave that. Can I do that? Let's see. I want to get back over to my Google Doc where I was just sort of summarizing. I grouped them, Brent, in sort of categories. We had questions that had to do with moisture management. I'll let you, this is like Jeopardy. You can pick a category that you want to talk about. You had a lot of questions about thinking through the nutrient management dynamics, and a couple people wondered how you might incorporate something like cover crops as a strategy in managing that initial period where you had a high C to N and some nitrogen tie-up.
Yeah, that question has actually come up quite a bit, and I think we have a better handle on it now. But I have since we didn't even have weeds growing very well in some of these orchards, I was trying to concentrate on just providing enough fertilizer for the little tree growing around it. And I do think I had one grower that recycled the walnut orchard that that took their time to recycling and added some manure, I think, over the top, and the cover crop grew fine. And they had a heavier soils, and I think they had more nitrogen in them already. And we didn't see an initial tie-up, but I haven't done much work with incorporating cover crops with whole orchard recycling, as I have just tried to meet the tree's initial nitrogen requirement, because we obviously have upset the carbon to nitrogen ratio. But in this orchard where we did recycle, that the grower planted a winter cover crop, initially you could see we had control sites that didn't receive wood chips, and you could see initially they were growing better than our cover crop, that our sites that had received the wood chips. But then a rain came, and by the end of the winter, you couldn't really tell a difference between the plots. So I think there was some initial nitrogen mineralization that came from that cover crop, or from the wood chips that did help that cover crop. But anyway, if you are interested in planting the cover crop initially, I would probably be prepared to add some nitrogen depending on the growth that you see, and we then planted a bean crop after that cover crop, and we could see we could still see in the bean growth, we could see that they didn't grow as well in the wood chip treatments than in the non-wood chip treatments, and we adjusted our bean fertilization to account for that too. So I think it can be done. You just might have to help them along initially, as they need nitrogen themselves.
Okay. There was a question. I'm going to stick with the nutrients for a minute, because there was several questions there. Let me go back to that. You've addressed a few of them with regards to the C to N. Somebody wanted to know what the target C to N was, and I'm not clear. I think maybe what you could offer is, what is a typical C to N of the wood chips when they're incorporated? I'm not sure you can adjust that per se, but.
Well, it's kind of a long, drawn out process, because even though we've incorporated the wood chips and we know we have all that carbon there, they're not decomposed enough to actually show up in a carbon analysis, So anyway, we've seen it go in the course of a season from like our carbon to nitrogen ratio from 20 to 1 to more like 8 to 1 by the end of the year, where we're in the area where we're adding the fertilizer. But you can't look at it like you just added 64 tons of carbon to the ground. You can't decide, oh, I want a 10 to 1 ratio, and you don't want to come and add 10,000 pounds of nitrogen, because we'll be wasting nitrogen and will cause nitrogen leaching. But the wood chips are not really part of the soil right away. It's almost an 8-year process that this takes, and so we see kind of a spike in the carbon to nitrogen ratio, but it's not as dramatic as you would think. Okay.
Hopefully that answered the question for the participant. And then one of the things that came up was, the timing of application of nitrogen is key in that replant process. And a lot of almond growers manage with tissue testing. So is there some guidance about maybe some closer monitoring of soil nitrogen when you're replanting following whole orchard recycling?
Yeah, when you normally replant an almond orchard, without whole orchard recycling, we've recommended to growers that they not fertilize right away, because we've had nitrogen burn issues where we're putting too much on too early. We need the roots to get established. We need the trees to get larger, and usually the trees, when they were bare root, replant trees coming from a nursery, they were pretty big, and the nurseries usually gave them plenty of nitrogen. So usually we would let the trees grow for 4 or 5 weeks and not apply any nitrogen. But with whole orchard recycling in that area around the root zone, we've disrupted that much that we have gone, or I did that. My most recent trial, I applied fertilizer at planting time. I used a granular fertilizer so that it was less likely to burn than injecting with UN32 or using I use triple 15, a less percentage ratio than, which I usually don't see burn on young trees with a triple 15 granular. So, and I applied a 1/4 ounce of actual N. We have a rule of thumb in almonds that we don't apply more than 1 actual ounce at any one time on trees their first year, because we've seen burning with more than that. So initially I was conscious of that, and I was worried about applying even 1 ounce to the actual basin of the tree when we were watering it in. So the first month or 2, I added a 1/4 ounce of nitrogen with every irrigation. And then when we started fertigating with UN32, I added 1 ounce per irrigation. So I added 5 ounces over the course of a season. We're trying to add only 1 ounce per month, and not trying to add more than 1 ounce at any one time.
Mm-hmm.
We still need to refine that more, but that was our most successful trial at the time.
Somebody just asked an interesting question. Would there be a possibility of planting a leguminous cover crop prior to termination of the orchard, so that at incorporation you might have more nitrogen in the system? The exact question was, might seeding an alfalfa crop 1 year before whole orchard recycling, the question says resolve the seed-to-N ratio, but at least maybe add some nitrogen to the system for that initial incorporation?
It might, I think the problem is typically, a grower is trying to get their last crop off in September, and then they're probably going to bring in these big machines and incorporate. So they usually have the ground mowed down and pretty barren for their harvest, and then they would immediately start their orchard removal process. So they would have to, plant early and have it incorporated before harvest, and that could be an option. More commonly, I've had growers after they've removed their orchard, when the wood chips are on top, they'll put a manure or some application on the top of the wood chips before they're incorporated now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I want to make sure we give some time to some of their categories. What's another category, Brent? Which one you want next? There were some questions about it seems to be getting at sort of a life cycle analysis, like of the whole process of doing whole orchard versus burning. The question is, Brent mentioned that the orchard soils treated with whole orchard recycle give off more greenhouse gases. Could you compare how much greenhouse gases they're giving off to how much would have been given off if the material was burned? So sort of the stand back assessment.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I should be careful how I say that, because we were comparing what's coming off the soil from our control plots, which didn't have any wood chips incorporated, versus our whole orchard recycling plots, which had wood chips incorporated. And of course, we're having, microbes and respiration increased where we've increased it. We have Elias Marvini and Alyssa Kindle at UC Davis have done more of a life cycle assessment, looking at the cogenerations versus burning. And of course, we're not comparing how much gases, carbon dioxide is coming off in air pollution in the burn treatment, but it's significantly greater in the burn treatment and even significantly greater from the cogeneration plant. So we do have people involved in the process to do that whole comparison, but you know, we feel that whole orchard recycling is the least is the more beneficial for our environment as a whole, because we're also not trucking 64 tons per acre of matter down the freeway to a cogeneration plant where we're later going to burn it. So we have people working on those studies, but I think the Air Pollution Control District and the CDFA had done a pretty good assessment of that in order to, you know, start rewarding growers for whole orchard recycling versus open field burning.
Well, and there's particulate matter air quality benefits as well. And so there's more than only the accounting sheet for the gases of greenhouse effect consideration. Yeah. So one question that's come up, and I want to make sure we get to it because I hear it too in my work, which is a couple of questions. One wanted to know, is there any interest or any application of this in vineyards or citrus or other types of cropping systems? Has that been explored or investigated?
You know, there have been several citrus orchards, I think, that have been ground up. I noticed that the San Joaquin Air Pollution Control District gave money for. I don't think there's a big problem with citrus. I mean, of course, it's green, but you tend to have less biomass per acre with the citrus. The discussion, though, I think the real dilemma right now for air quality boards and the California Air Resources Board is of course vineyard removal. And right now, you know, when the vineyards are removed, they have a lot of wire in them and metal stakes, and they used to just push these all into big piles and burn it, and then they could burn out the wood and collect the metal. So if I think the vineyards could be easily recycled, but they are going to have to spend some time and money, you know, cutting out these metal stakes and cutting out the wire first before they could do that. So that, I think that's going to be a big area of interest, because I noticed with the whole the recent ruling by the California Air Resources Board that to restrict open field burning by January 1st, 2025, I think is that most of the areas that were still burning were vineyards, while a significant amount of the orchards had been recycled.
Yeah, and I will add to that thought. I know that CDFA's Healthy Soils program relies heavily on the COMET model to predict greenhouse gas benefit from a particular practice. And they have a cutoff of age of an orchard where they believe they've hit that balance that we were talking about a few minutes ago of how much carbon you're going to capture in the soil versus lose in burning. And so there is the vineyards have not reached that because the biomass that you're converting isn't great enough, apparently, to quite tip that. So it might be something that I would encourage folks to continue to watch when Healthy Soils has their open comment period. You might want to watch and see if there's something that is pertinent to your interest, because that's all part of those discussions. I'm going to switch gears now, Brent. There's two more major areas where we had questions, and that had to do with the sort of water balance dynamics in these systems after incorporation. And then also there were several questions pertinent to sort of soil biology and pest management following. So which one you want to tackle first? You get to choose.
Well, the water question, I just reminded, I had some neutron probe data slide that I forgot to insert in this presentation, but we can do the water. I think the water's interesting.
Let me just give you, there were several questions. Let me just give them to you all because you may answer them connected. So the questions were, one was they were curious about the difference in soil moisture between the mulched and bare fields, and I think you addressed that. Are there studies specifically on drought resilience benefits is one of the questions. And then based on improvements to water holding capacity, infiltration, et cetera, how might a grower anticipate irrigation scheduling would require some, perhaps some new monitoring strategies or perhaps adjustment and total water application needs over, the space of as the orchard is establishing. So the questions are there studies on drought resilience benefits? And then based on improvements to water holding capacity, how might that impact irrigation water management scheduling?
Well, we did implement a deficit irrigation trial for 2 years in this older block, and we knew from previous work from David Goldhammer that a retired professor in plant land, air, and water resources, I think, at UC Davis, but we knew that we could irrigate at about 85% of the recommended ET or evapotranspiration rate, and probably still maintain our crop nicely, and we've used that figure for drought management area, but in our, when we implemented this deficit irrigation experiment between our grind treatment with the whole orchard recycling versus the burn, we had less stress in the grind treatment than the burn, and we did have increased yields in the grind than the burn. I don't know if we've got it worked out enough to actually recommend a different irrigation practice, but in the new trial where we're monitoring right now, we have noticed we have we're taking neutron probe readings at different depths and different times of the year, and we're seeing increased water holding, increased moisture levels in the whole orchard recycling treatments. Now we're not irrigating any differently yet. We're just trying to meet the crop's water needs and use. It's interesting that right before an irrigation, they don't look as much different, but then right after the irrigation, and I'm sorry I forgot to put this data on, but the whole orchard recycling treatments have significantly more water in the upper profile, and it decreases as you go down. So we have observed increased water holding capacity. We're not at the point where we could say we need to irrigate 15% less, because we did practice whole orchard recycling, but we do believe we're going to show increased water and nutrient efficiency with the practice.
And if I could ask you to put on your grower hat, have you tinkered with it on your operation? Because you've got a lot of years in your reestablished orchard, and you've been through a drought or two now.
Yeah. No, the orchard that I showed unfortunately in the start of the presentation is I still live there, but I only have 3 acres instead of what I had. So we did get surrounded by houses, but in the older trial at Kearney, we did implement this drought, and we do think that the increased water holding capacity is probably one of the mechanisms, that probably the most likely mechanism why we're seeing increased yields and tree growth as a result.
Okay.
So
okay.
we did have a paper in that +1 journal where we think that whole orchard recycling is increasing the resiliency of of almond production in California with climate change by adding more carbon and organic matter.
So is that paper linked to the Whole Orchard Recycling website somewhere?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
on.
So again, encourage people to go there to look for some more details. There's a really practical question here that seems like a good one to answer. What is the particle size range of ground and chipped recycled orchard material? So can you give us kind of ballpark?
That's a good point that I did not mention in my presentation. We've obviously assumed, you know, when we're using these big horizontal grinders, when they were sending the wood chips to the cogeneration plants, they would typically use a 4-inch screen so that everything that came out of that grinder was 4 inches or less. But since we started Whole Orchard Recycling, they do have a 2-inch screen, which means everything that comes out of that grinder will be 2 inches or less. So we've actually recommended, for a number of reasons, that the grower, it costs them a little bit longer to run everything through that 2-inch screen, but we think it's beneficial for the grower in the long run to have this reduced size of wood chips as we start off. But then when you look at the product when it comes out, it's very interesting because you will have everything that's as big as 2 inches, but there's also a lot of sawdust that comes out of the grinding process. So we have everything from sawdust to 2 inches in size. And I think that that's very important in the mineralization of the product we see, because the sawdust is going to mineralize faster and become part of the soil or the carbon much more quickly than a 2-inch piece of wood. And one of the things that I need to point out with the Iron Wolf trial that we're basing a lot of this early data with, it ground up things. There were bowling ball pin sizes of wood in the ground. So that carbon's probably going to stay. They're probably still bowling ball pins buried where the Iron Wolf went through. So we have seen faster decomposition rates in these other machines.
Good. Okay, I think that addressed that question. I want to switch before we lose time, because there were several questions on soil biology and pest management. And I think what I'll do is I'll share your website, because I think you have a nice summary of some of those findings. There's a link, one of the links there, and maybe then you could talk us through it. But here are the questions we got. One, could you explain, early on you talked about shifts in nematode and fungal populations. Could you just talk about, in particular, the nematodes? Are they parasitic nematodes? Why is that shift? They weren't the disease-causing ones, but could you talk a little bit about that? And then the other two, I think you can talk through. I'll pull up your website while maybe you address that first one.
Yeah, well, you know, there are the plant parasitic nematodes, and fortunately or unfortunately, that the sites that we had didn't have large populations of plant parasitic nematodes. But what we have found in these different trials is there are nematodes. The nematodes are a very common worm that lives in the soil, and a small percentage of them are parasitic, where they have these stylets that can penetrate roots of trees or crop plants and suck juices out or lay eggs inside. But a lot of these nematodes are saprophytic or non-plant parasitic, and a lot of them just have like these trough-like mouth parts, and they'll actually eat bacteria and protozoans and organisms in the soil, and they're actually have them divided into lots of categories. They have fungal feeding nematodes and they have bacterial feeding nematodes. And so we suspect with Whole Orchard Recycling, since we added 64 tons per acre of wood chips, we added a food source for bacteria and fungi that are decomposing them. And And as a result, we've seen these fungal and bacterial feeding nematodes increase significantly. And one of the reasons why I cite that is that they're actually pretty, determining what organisms are present in the soil is a very complex process, and a lot of people are using DNA techniques, and it's really way over my head. But I had a nematology friend, and you could look in the soil very easily and find these saprophytic nematodes and quantify them. So it's basically was just, we counted mushrooms and initially, and we looked at these saprophytic nematodes as one of the easiest organisms to identify. Now our team is using DNA techniques to look at bacteria and involve more in the nitrogen process of converting ammonia to nitrite to nitrate, and we're using molecular techniques now, which is over my head, but so the nematodes were just a very good technique to look at, what organisms were surviving. And then that phospholipid fatty acid technique was another fairly good technique to look at general populations, but not specific taxa.
Well, I think you just illustrated beautifully how sometimes the simple observations still offer something of value. So they're worth including in any venture. Yeah. I've pulled up your, I think you guys can see the screen. Brent, do you want to talk through what people are looking at there? And I will try to pop over and see the, I can't see when I'm sharing my screen. I don't appear to be able to see the questions. So Sarah or Kristen, maybe you can add them.
You got it. The questions say, how have there been trials regarding Phytophthora and mulch application? And can you comment on whole orchard recycling practice causing more fungal disease in the trees, i.e. there's more places for bad and good fungus to hide and survive?
Well, this question actually comes up a lot, and first of all, Greg Brown, who's a USDA scientist at UC Davis, he's a plant pathologist, and he's been involved with the trials from the get-go, just because we wanted to see if we had a replant disease issue. We haven't had a problem with prunus replant disease, but I'm not going to say we're never going to have a problem. With the Phytophthora, I mentioned the slide, I had Phytophthora and Pythium. Those are oomycetes, and that particular type of pathogen has cellulose in its cell walls. So we actually think that whole orchard recycling is reducing Phytophthora and Pythium. And there's a lot of supporting literature on that. This Dr. Mungi at UC Riverside, who's long retired, he showed that where Phytophthora was causing issues in avocado and citrus orchards in the Southern California, that mulching wood chips on the top significantly reduced Phytophthora. So we haven't had any. We haven't had enough Phytophthora in any of our trials to make any recommendation, but I did show Greg Brown's work where Pythium was reduced with whole orchard recycling. So certain fungal diseases, I'm pretty sure that we are reducing. Now, I often get asked in my area about Armillaria root rot or oak root rot, and some growers are afraid to whole orchard recycle that because there could come up in the crown and get spread around the orchard. But we haven't been very successful at stopping whole oak root rot in general. But I mean, I would recommend. I have several growers that after talking with me extensively and we weighed the pros and cons, they have done whole orchard recycling, because we're hoping that all this basidiomycete activity will be inhibitory to Armillaria, where usually they're kind of playing that they're only the basidiomycete in the orchard, and they have a fine role between being a wood rotter and a decomposer. But another area that I think is pretty interesting is that I don't know if people are very familiar with the Strobo urine fungicides, but they were produced from a Strobo urus basidiomycete or mushroom that produces a toxin that inhibits other fungi. So a lot of the new fungicides that we use commercially now, like Pristine and Flint and Gem, have this chemistry in them, which was basically produced by a wood rotting mushroom. And we've learned how to reproduce that. And so why I'm saying all this is I think having a lot of these mushrooms in your orchard, they're very antagonistic to each other. And I'm hoping to have some data at some point that shows that wood chipping is antagonistic to Armillaria, but we don't have that yet. But Roger Duncan tried to do an Armillaria root stock trial where he ground up a bunch of infected roots, and none of the ground up roots inoculum survived. So anyway, they got colonized by another fungus. So anyway, we think there's some circumstantial evidence that whole orchard recycling, the decomposing process of that wood decomposing is probably going to break down, that wood's in the soil now, it's not up in the tree. And I feel that if the enzymes that are strong enough to break down cellulose are probably strong enough to break down the pathogens that were surviving in that wood before. So we haven't seen a problem yet. I can't say that we never will, but I'm hopeful.
Okay, I think that addressed it, and people can go find more detail through the website and look at the specific research. There's one question that came in that we haven't gotten to that I want to make sure we're clear about. Does whole orchard recycling and applying the wood chips to orchards qualify for carbon sequestration credits? The answer is yes, through the Healthy Soils program at CDFA. So if you want more information about that, I would encourage you to go to their Healthy Soils program. Maybe Sarah, you could drop that link in the chat. There's a new question here. What is the reason to let dry out the wood chips on the soil before incorporating? Is that so? The question is the timing, following the chipping. What's the reasoning for the timing of incorporation?
In some of our trials, we incorporated right away, depending on whether the deep ripper came in or whether a stubble disc came in. Now some people feel that, that Armillaria and some other pathogens don't like to be chipped up or left on the soil surface where it's pretty dry. So there is a feeling that by letting the wood chips dry out more on the soil surface, that the pathogens inside them may also die more quickly. But we haven't been able to do that kind of experimentation. We're usually at the will of the grower who's lining up the next piece of machine to come in.
Yeah. There was a question with regard to how common the Armillaria root rot is in almonds, and for that I would refer people to the UC IPM websites where you can get good information about any of these diseases.
Yeah, oak root rot is more common in the Sacramento Valley and northern San Joaquin because it used to grow along on oaks along rivers. So it's not as common in Kern County as it is in Butte County, for instance.
Okay, I think Sarah and Kristen, if I've missed questions, please holler them out. I think we have hit the questions that we got in our chat. Do you guys see any I missed?
I'm looking at this one about how much does it cost per acre to do whole orchard recycling? Have you looked into quantifying the dollars per megaton CO2 benefits? You get some of that on one of your slides.
I'm not, I mean, part of our team might have looked at, I do know how much it costs. I don't know how it compares to megaton CO2 benefit though, but you know, it costs growers about, you know, what I mentioned earlier, that they used to remove their, get their orchards removed basically for free, because the cogeneration plants used to be paying the growers, used to be paying the orchard removal companies, and now the cogeneration plants are not paying the orchard removal companies. So it costs about $600 an acre to grind up those trees, whether the grower is keeping the wood chips or not. If they're keeping the wood chips, they're having to spread them back on the ground. That's probably another $300 or $400 an acre. So we're looking at close to $1,000 an acre to implement whole orchard recycling.
And I just pulled up from your website, Brent, you do have a cost benefit guide for producers to consult if they want to think about whether it works for them.
Yeah. Well, and you know that after January 1st, 2025, they're not going to allow burning at all. And it's harder statewide, it's harder in the San Joaquin Valley to burn, but you know, you can still get exemptions, but and right now though, the cost of the burn permits have gone up to $400 or $500 an acre in some regions. So you've got a cost whether you're burning too.
Right. Sarah, I'm going to leave it to you. You want to leave a few minutes for folks to be able to finish out in our scheduled time?
Yeah, well, just want to give some thank yous right now. That was super interesting and great questions. In just a second, I'm going to share my screen with that QR code for the CCAs in the audience. In the meantime, those of you who don't use that, please go ahead and enter your full name and license number in the chat, and I'll submit that. So altogether, thank you so much, Brent. Thank you so much, Karen, for hosting a great discussion. I want to invite people back to CARCD's webpage, where we have 2 more upcoming meetings of the California Farm Demonstration Network. I just dropped a link in the chat where you can register for those, and that's also where you're going to find recordings of both this session and all the sessions. Until we have that standalone website coming later this year for the California Farm Demonstration Network. So we have lots of thank yous coming in, really appreciate it. And we'll hang on for a few more minutes. I think at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and share. Thank you.
I do want to